Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about something that is really important to me and has really changed my life, and that is Jenkum.
There's a new way for your kids to get high. They're using raw sewage.
I couldn't imagine doing something like that. Sounds pretty sick to me.
Honestly, they need to find something better to do with their life. Seriously.
Something new, something stimulating, something different.
There's a lot of people that say it's a hoax or it's not real or it's just made up or whatever. Now let's just get this out of the way first, so you can laugh it all off or whatever, You won't be laughing once you experience what I have and have your life change. But, it's human waste. It's, shit.
Oh, Lou Starsky. That's who reached out to me, I think, initially to have me on ACTJ, right?
Yeah, he's the guy that follows all the comics, so he knew who you were. I had to, kind of look you up and everything. Just because I'm not always in that realm. I should be, probably.
You're not into laughter?
I produce laughter, but I don't consume it too much, I guess.
Yeah. I get it. So I guess tell me a little bit about how you guys came about, the podcast, because it's kind of an interesting format, and you have so many different guys that are part of it that sort of have all different backgrounds.
Yeah. A lot of that is just, it's a brainchild of mine where I like getting different perspectives on all sorts of things. But a lot of those guys like Lou, I met him in a troll group. Called Mad World that I used to kind of run. It was like a 30,000 member thirst trap. So that's where I met Lou. Thad, he came on as a guest on the original ACTJ when it was the Armenian Council for Truth and Journalism, which is another story in and of itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an interesting one.
Are you Armenian?
Like I say, it's good. Oh, no, not at all.
Okay.
Like I was on Bobby Pickles' show. I don't know if you know who that is.
No.
He's the guy who kind of does a lot of merch for Proud Boys. But I was on his show and he was asking me the same thing. I said, no, that's just straight cultural appropriation. But that was, see, that's where I say it goes back and forth all the time. That was Farmington Tribune, which was the satire site on Facebook that I had started back in 2018. And when people would say, no, this is fake news, I would, I was thinking of this joke my dad would tell me that was from Fire Sign Theater albums, where it was the Armenian Medical Association. So I just kind of clicked saying, no, this has been independently verified by the Armenian Council for Truth and Journalism. And so that's where that kind of started, was a joke.
And then it sort of evolved into the American Council for Truth and Journalism.
Yeah, that was just a branding decision on some point because I got tired of explaining the name to everybody who didn't get the joke.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's I imagine there are a lot of people, too, who thought that was some sort of reference, perhaps, or contradiction to the Young Turks, right? Because, TYT sort of always presents themselves as like this arbiter of truth, and yet you're named after one of the ugliest lies in the history of humanity, or withheld truths, right? I don't know that it's necessarily a lie, but like to name yourself after like a battalion that was essentially committed genocide against an entire group of people, and then to call yourself, to essentially be a liberal news organization is the It would be like if patriots started calling themselves the Fourth Reich. It's like, nah, I don't know. If
there's a few of them out there that do that. That's for sure.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't call them patriots.
I wouldn't call them patriots either.
Yeah,
but knuckleheads? Can we call them knuckleheads?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there new Nazis? Yeah, I think we're all aware that that's a real thing. But it's amazing. It's amazing to me the sort of cognitive dissonance you have to like name your outfit the Young Turks and then sort of pretend to be the arbiters of anything just.
Yeah, that's the way that goes. It's interesting to me too. My uncle is actually Turkish. And after I had gone to Armenia in late 2019, because that was kind of the first thing I did when I started my media company, was I said, well, after all the jokes I've told,
as most people do with Armenia or with media companies, it's like you start a media company, you go to Armenia.
Well, in my case, it made sense because of all the jokes. I figured that, the least I could do was go actually try to learn something firsthand about this country. And really the idea behind that was to produce a documentary that kind of mocked American ignorance. So that was the idea. I don't know if anything
it's a little
really
bit of material there.
Yeah, I don't know if anything really good will ever be produced down the road. I mean, I don't expect to be able to travel anytime soon. Although Armenia doesn't have any sort of, vaccinations you have to have when you get there. They basically look at your passport, they give you a dirty stink eye, and you're at an airport that has, 4 gates, and then you go into this city of 1.5 million people. So. But that was kind of the impetus for that trip. And that was what I had intended to do at that time.
What kind of interested you in this whole space of, you said you met Lou kind of like in a troll group or things like that. But I guess what kind of drew you into the whole sort of politics and culture space to begin with? I mean, we live in a time now where I feel like so many people try to abstain from all of it as much as possible. I feel like it's impossible now to live a life where you're not involved or affected in some way by what's going on in the world. But do you remember that kind of moment where it first became of interest to you, or you first sort of leaned into that world?
Yeah, I mean, I was a kid. I was always interested in it. I was always interested in history, politics, and everything else. I mean, before I had children and everything kind of took a different path in my life, I was going to college and I was studying political science, philosophy, and all these things. And that was kind of the direction that I wanted to head with my life. And then at the time, I got my then girlfriend, who I call the moon of my life. She's been with me so long and we've been through so much together, but she got pregnant. And so it was kind of an easy decision that was made for me that I guess I was going to follow my father's footsteps and become a plumber. And so I dropped out of school and that's what I did. Yeah. But it was always something that was there, and I always wanted to do something with it. I mean, really in 2018, I had just gotten to a point in my career where I could start to branch out and do different things that I'd always wanted to do. I mean, when you're an entrepreneur for long enough, that's just how you deal with life. If you want to do things, you do them. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. It's interesting because I talk about a lot with other, libertarian or conservative friends that, a lot of times one of the hardest things to get people to want to do in our world is collaborate. And say, well, in a way, the ideology kind of lends itself to that problem. It's like we're all such individuals and we're all so self-motivated in many ways that collaboration is not our first thing. Whereas I feel like when you look at ideologically the other side of the spectrum, right, socialists and sort of Leninites and that type of thing, it's all about the collective. And so, of course, those people I think naturally have a better proclivity to collaboration, whereas our thing is like to do our own thing. And then you don't end up with like one conservative version of Twitter. You end up with 50 and none of them really take.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's something that I've learned throughout all the years was, even with ACTJ, you asked how everybody came together, but I've compared it to a band at some point. None of us are getting paid.
Right.
We try to show up for the gig every night. We fight all the time behind the scenes, sometimes on camera, just depends on the evening. But it really is like that. And I guess that's the collaborative effort. But, in the end, I'm a punk rocker. So, yeah, that's the other stuff that I did in one of my past lives.
Yeah, I guess we have that in common. I was a band guy when I was in high school and had a high school band and everything right after I got out of school. And then I stopped playing music around 22, 23, and then found comedy, about a year after I stopped playing music and never really looked back. But the music days were kind of I don't know, it's in many ways probably like my birthplace of sort of being contrarian, right? In a time where so many kids in our school were playing sports or doing sort of more traditional extracurriculars, when you sort of break away and you start doing this thing that is like not a school activity and not It's expensive. It's hard to do. You sort of set out on a path of being a little bit rebellious and individual right from that point on, because it's not something you get. It's also not something that a lot of people are supportive of.
No, I think that's a lot of it. I mean, I remember the first time I heard a Misfits album, and I thought it was the most amazing thing ever. And it was just because of that kind of contradiction where it was this real like 50s music, but you've got Glenn Danzig over there screaming about how he raped your baby today. And it was beautiful to me. I loved it. And so that kind of set the tone for my life in a lot of ways, where it's like you use that shock value to make people even think about some deeper issues here and there. And to me, that was always punk rock. That was the purpose of it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how, and Gavin McInnes and I talk about this a lot, about how conservatism has almost become, there's like this new division of it that is very punk rock, and that I think, a lot of us that are in the space have a responsibility, not just a desire, but a responsibility to kind of shock people into common sense. And, and I think I've long held, excuse me, I've long held the belief that I think not only should art be offensive, but I think it has a responsibility to offend, because for a lot of people, that is the only way for them to consider a viewpoint that isn't already theirs, is to kind of snatch their attention and sort of disrupt the lines that they're already viewing the world on. And I think great art has always done that, and punk rock for sure. I'll ask you this question, because I've asked a lot of people this. Do you feel like the lack of having like a real rebellious genre of music today sort of affects the level of conformity? Because this really is the first time where it doesn't feel like there is a sort of punk rock, heavy metal, or rock and roll counterculture to the mainstream. I mean, in the 90s we had, or even like I'd say the late 80s, early 90s, we had hair metal. In the mid 90s to early 2000s, we had sort of pop punk, which was almost sort of like this, before it was kind of co-opted by the labels, it was almost like a slap in the face of pop music, right? It was these groups trying to sort of ridicule the idea of bubblegum pop music, but do it in more of an aggressive, in-your-face way. And then going back to obviously the 80s when you had heavy metal, and then the classic punk rock of the 60s and 70s. I mean, there really isn't now, in probably the last 10 years, an example of a real mainstream, or not even mainstream, but a real successful kind of rock and roll counterculture.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, it's funny. I was even, I scroll through things on, one of my many fake profiles on Facebook, and
yeah, we'll talk in a minute as to why you have to do that now.
Right. And, it's like, I go through that, and, I still follow a lot of these punk rock groups and a lot of things that I used to follow. And I saw that there was going to be this band playing in Denver. And they had on their concert poster, "Wear your fucking mask."
Yeah.
And I just thought to myself, I said, what has happened to all of this? I mean, how did this become punk rock? Sure, they've got the spikes, they got the mohawk, they've got the bull dyke playing the drums, rock and roll. That's cool. I like that. But then when it comes down to their messaging, they're telling everybody, hurry up and lick the boot. Yeah. Beyond saying cops are bad, they don't have any other message, and it's weak.
Yeah, it's really wild. I mean, when you see bands like the Foo Fighters, I mean, like, I think back to Nirvana smashing their instruments on stage on SNL. And then now you've got Dave Grohl telling people that if they don't mask up and don't vaccinate, don't come to my shows. It's like, where did it go wrong?
Yeah, how bad is it? How bad is it that the most rebellious rock and roller out there right now is like Eric Clapton?
It's so true.
Like that ought to tell you everything that's wrong with society right now. I mean, I always looked at the hippies, and how they just kind of bought into the system and turned into these yuppie scum. And I was just like, this is gross. I used to give my dad crap about it even, and he's not even really a yuppie, he's just a hippie that turned working class. But it's absurd. These kids are.
Reminds me of that line from SLC Punk where he goes, "Just remember, son, I didn't sell out. I bought in."
Yeah. And for the first time in my life, I'm 18 and I can say, "Fuck you." Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's, that to me was like one of the most impressionable lines in a movie of, you know, of that sort of rationalization that people have when they really do sort of give up on their dreams or give up on their ambitions, or in a lot of ways just sort of give up on the truth. Yeah. And I feel like that's kind of where we're at now, where even the most, you know, the most culturally rebellious natured people are just giving up on truth because conformity is easier. And you know, there's so much money and popularity at stake. And then when you see somebody like a Nicki Minaj go like, fuck all that noise, I'm going to tell the truth. Yeah. You know, that's inspiring whether you're a fan of that person or not.
Sure. I mean, I'm not a fan of her particularly. I don't like her music. I mean, I like big booty women. You know, I mean, as anybody who knows me can tell you, I've never shied away from, you know, time with ladies or anything, so I can appreciate all that stuff. Yeah, well,
your name is actually German for lover of big ass. I don't know.
I think so. Yeah, that is the exact translation, as I recall. Yeah. And then what does Jenkum mean? It's huffing intellectual No, it's intellectual conversation that rises above the fray, I believe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it's we don't dress it up here. It is Jenkum is a fake drug that people believed was huffing fermented shit, and it's interesting because it's just sort of become what we do now as a culture, is we huff fermented shit and pretend we're getting high on anything other than nonsense.
Well, just this entire culture of, you know, going out and grabbing likes and trying to garner response. And that was something even, you know, in the years when I was kind of trolling heavy, I guess you could say, that you always used against people, was their obsession with wanting to be important. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's probably what's wrong with punk rock and everything else, is it's not even about, you know, countering the culture anymore. It's about trying to fit in and gain acceptance.
Yeah, I do. That's why I kind of laugh when people, you know, so I get accused of that sometimes. People go, well, you're just sort of like trolling for likes, or you're saying radical shit to like get attention. It's like, you do realize that I was in the system of conformity where I could have just stayed and done what I was told, had it continue to have a TV show, continue to make decent money, and shut all that other shit down. And I decided to say more unpopular things to get more negative attention, because that, you know, that's just to be the better grift. I mean, it's insane to me that people can come to that conclusion without really like looking at the facts of like, no, I was in the room to sell out, and I just didn't want to. Yeah. And they also didn't make it worth my while either. So, you know, and who knows, maybe that was because ultimately they knew I was a guy who would just never really ever be able to keep his, you know, mouth shut. Yeah. But you know, I was certainly in a position to sort of to give up on anything that mattered to me. And you know, I didn't do it. The life didn't pan out that way. Well, that's also not why I got into comedy. Like, I got into comedy, you know, like when I started doing stand-up, I had a really good day job. I was making 6 figures a year at 23 years old, traveling all over the country and building a company that was a really, really hot brand at the time and had all the sort of job security in the world. And, you know, I just went to comedy because it sort of called me. The first time I did it, I got hooked. And for me, the thing was like, oh, I can come do this thing and have this outlet where I can say all the shit that I think all day that I'm not really allowed to say or that I don't have a platform for. And so this will be my outlet. And, you know, eventually it through the way that life kind of deals you the cards, it went from being my outlet to being my career. And but I'll be damned if I ever wanted to do it any other way than the way I initially set out to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I can appreciate that. I mean, there's nothing that's fun about taking a stand or on anything, however you do it, whether you do it through jokes and you make people think that way, or you do it by just spitting the truth as it is. It's not fun. I've lost so many friends and people that I thought were my friends just because I did things like, you know, people loved us, you know, on ACTJ when we were covering the different BLM protests. And I always tried to approach it as pragmatically as possible, where I said, okay, well, I may not agree with anything these kids are saying on some level. Sure, it may be coordinated by a bunch of Marxists, but they have a right to speak. Mm-hmm. And so that was always something that I felt was important. And like I say, there was a lot of people that loved me then when I was saying that. But the minute I went to Washington, D.C., and I spent some time around some Proud Boys, and that's really where I was embedded out there. And the minute I did that and showed kind of a different light of these people than what had been put out in the mainstream media, then all of a sudden everybody hated my guts. And they're saying, you've changed, Shawn. And no, I didn't change. You changed.
Well, what I think is interesting too is, and talking about ACTJ, the American Council for Truth in Journalism. I mean, that name obviously comes from, it sounds like a focus on getting to the truth. And what I think is always interesting is that people don't like when your pursuit of the truth tells them something they don't want to believe. Yeah. And so like a good example is, and I'll ask you more about, how you sort of met with Proud Boys or fell into that world. But what was interesting to me was when I started meeting people who were affiliated with that group, it completely contradicted everything that the mainstream media was telling me. And I had met a few, like I have a few friends that are comedians who were either dating somebody in the Proud Boys or friends with somebody in the Proud Boys. And the amazing thing you find out is like these aren't white men, these aren't white nationalists, these are sort of like traditional Western westernized guys, and this is sort of like a men's club, and I was kind of along for the creation of that group just from being like a Compound Media fan and watching Anthony and watching Gavin on that network. So I remember kind of watching it start. And then you start to see this narrative of like, oh, this is what it's become. And then you look at reality and you go, oh my God, this is like completely the opposite of what the media is telling us. I mean, how did you initially, walk me through that. How did you go from kind of in a weird way on the podcast defending, BLM's right to free speech to finding yourself like in DC in a herd of Proud Boys?
Well, I think it's like anything else where with me, I my opinions are mutable, right? I don't sit here and have these hard opinions that I'll never consider changing. And so it was just part of that. When I looked at what was going on, obviously there was some funny business going on in the election.
And what's the timeline of this when you're sort of end up in DC? Is this leading up to the 2020 election? Is this after the 2020 election?
Well, we had done the show all summer. I mean, we had just a slew of like really good guests on, that were far above our pedigree. We still kind of have a tendency to do that for a show that really doesn't get viewed. We have really amazing guests on. One of those, we had Spike Cohen on from the Libertarian Party. He was the Libertarian presidential or vice presidential candidate. Yeah. He came on. That was kind of a big point in the show. There was another woman that came on, Lily Tong Williams, who's a libertarian. She had escaped China, grew up in the Cultural Revolution. Really amazing story. And she had come on. So all these things kind of play into it. And you watch everything that's going on with, the coronavirus and the lockdowns, and I really started to take, I guess they called black pills, but you look around at the world and you say, no, this isn't adding up. And so, I've always, if I get the chance, I like to do primary source journalism because you can only sit there and scroll through a Twitter feed so much. You glean only so much information from that. You have to get on the ground. You have to go see what's going on with your own eyes. So that's really what happened. And, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one of the things that lends to that too, is when you look at how news is reported these days, it's almost like they're getting a hold of a narrative before the story even comes out. And the recent example I'll use is like in California, they were writing stories like Twitter had #1 trending on Twitter at about 11 in the morning on Tuesday. Independent fact checkers have proven that there is no widespread election fraud in the California recall. And I go, it's fucking 11 a.m. Like the election we're not even halfway through. And you're already saying we've already looked into it and it's all ship-shape. It's like when you start to see stories like that look like all of these movies we grew up watching where a celebrity gets in a scandal and the PR machine goes to work right away to kind of get in front of the story. It's like you're starting to see that happen with regular news.
Yeah. So, that's it. that's the reason for going out there. I wanted to get ahead of that story. On the first trip on November 14th of 2020, I took my buddy Vladimir with me because he's the guy that went to Armenia with me, made sure that I could, order food and things like that when we were over there.
Yeah, we all need a Vladimir.
Yeah, we all need a Vladimir. If you know Vladimir, he's literally one of the best people to ever, grace this planet with his presence. But, he's always been a Trump supporter, much more so than I.
Yeah, why do you think so many immigrants or people who come here from other countries were so drawn to Trump? I mean, my belief is that, and this is what I said to everybody who was like shocked that he won in 2016, but I was like, this guy's been the billboard for American greatness for 60 years, right? Yeah. Like when people think about American prosperity and jet skis and big tits and blonde hair and Corvettes and Coca-Cola, they think of Donald Trump. And so it's like wondering why Mickey Mouse would win the presidency of Disney World. It's like, yeah, he's been the mascot for America for half a century. Of course he's going to win the election. But, I asked you your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, what I see, and it's interesting, my cousin, he's a noted historian who runs away from me all the time now, but I still love him. But he's talked about how in Eastern Europe and Russia, there's always been this desire to have a strong man. And so the most simple explanation for why Eastern Europeans like him, I think, is that. And then it goes even deeper where, they grew up under communism, so they can see this creep into our country and they can see where it's getting us. And they were told about this by their grandparents. So it's really not that difficult to ascertain the reasons why, in my mind. They're watching something happen that they already had occur in their families in their lifetime.
Yeah, and it's curious to me why so many Americans, didn't really see that as a threat. And then I look at stories like what came out yesterday that I shared. It was a story about the disparity in voting in the California recall between people with college degrees and people without. And then, obviously the journalist tried to paint it as, dumb people voted for the recall and smart people voted against it. And I said, well, that's not really what the data tells me. The data shows me what a tremendous amount of success they're having with sort of liberal and Marxist indoctrination in colleges, and to where they're just being told. And I only have my own anecdotal experience to go off of, but every single one of my friends who were like, we're going to vote to keep Newsom in, I asked them why. I didn't argue with them. I just said, why do you think he's great? Why do you think he should stay in? And they told me overwhelmingly three things. Number one, they told me that the homelessness problem has been around since the 1960s. And so that's not his fault. And even though the numbers have doubled since the start of the pandemic for both LA and San Francisco. So the data doesn't support that. But it is this sort of cognitive dissonance of like, those homeless hippies have been around since the 60s, which does lend a little understanding as to what their upbringing was probably like, where they were sort of suburban and shielded from it. The second thing was all these mandates, he's just trying to keep us safe from the pandemic. So they obviously didn't see the French Laundry thing or didn't care about it. Then when he went on the news and laughed in everybody's face about disobeying his own ordinance. So they didn't care about the hypocrisy of that. And a side note, most of those people work in sort of offices or corporate jobs, and so they weren't really affected like an entrepreneur like yourself or like me when these ordinances go into place, and now no comedy clubs are open, there's no places to perform, there's no other ways to make money. And even if you were doing gig economy stuff like rideshare or food delivery, all of that business went to sleep at the beginning of the pandemic because people weren't leaving their homes. And, they weren't doing anything. So even if you had some sort of like side gig, like I was driving rideshare, that went completely to sleep. And there was just I would go out to drive and there would be like, I'd get like 4 rides over the course of 4 hours, which is normally would be like 1 hour. You'd never stop working. So I had to kind of abandon ship from my entire game plan at that point and just figure out how am I going to continue, making money. But that's just one channel. And then the third channel, which to me is the most ridiculous sort of just pill swallowing example of where they're just sort of following the indoctrination is I literally had half of them say to me, well, he's not a white supremacist like Larry Elder, who is black. And it's like, you know, at that point, you just go like, if you are so hooked up to the government umbilical cord and the mainstream media, where the mainstream media can tell you a black man is a white supremacist, and you just go, sounds about right.
Yeah.
Without any sort of further investigation, that tells me that your brain isn't all the way turned on. And so when you look at those things, those three things that kind of, you know, march down the line. And then people would say things like, he thinks there shouldn't be a minimum wage, which is actually a pretty popularly held concept by a lot of economists. That actually might be a way to drive up wages and improve life, is by not setting a basement, because so many industries that consider themselves entry-level industries just sort of start at the basement and make you work your way up from there. And it's almost like the government allowing them not to have to compete in the open marketplace. So I don't want to ramble about
no, that's all good.
But I
ramble on sometimes.
You know, these are things that, like, it's amazing that nobody sort of investigates further, of like you, and I say this to kind of find some common ground here, is that like you, when I hear something that's so fucking crazy it can't possibly be true, my nature is to look into it. So even if I weren't already a Larry Elder follower, or hadn't watched the 3-hour podcast with Joe Rogan and Peter Thiel where he explained why the minimum wage is actually counterintuitive to driving people up into the middle class and above the middle class, I would have heard this guy wants to abolish the minimum wage, and I go, let me fucking investigate this, because that sounds retarded. Yeah. And then I would hear and find out the logic, and I would go, okay, even if I didn't agree with it, I would still be driven to investigate that further. And it's amazing to me how many people just sort of hear that narrative and go, oh yeah, well then fuck him, I won't vote for him.
Yeah. Well, it's like on that note with, you know, and kind of going back to what we were talking about with punk rock and rebellion and everything else, you know, to this day, I still consider myself philosophically an anarchist, and nothing kills me more than watching these kids these days. And now I sound like an old man, you know, these kids these days, look at them out there. And
we every time we say these kids these days, we get a gray hair in our beard, right?
Yeah, I know. Exactly. I've got tons of them, but it's like, you know, I look at them and I'm going, yeah, you guys are out here and you'll do the circle of A, you'll spray paint that here and there, you know, you'll do your ACAB, and then you're over there going, we need the government to give us a higher minimum wage.
Right.
Sure. Okay, cool.
Yeah, or we need the government to keep us safe from, you know, illness,
from the virus,
the virus, which is, you know, even from the purest of libertarian perspectives, is hardly the government's responsibility or role in society. But anyway, so in you and Vlad, your Armenian ambassador.
Well, he's Lithuanian,
right? But he was your ambassador to Armenia.
He was my translator. Yeah.
So the Lithuanian Vlad, you guys pack up and head to DC to kind of get on the ground and sort of investigate the truth behind what's going on leading into the election.
Yeah. So I mean, that went, you know, pretty standard out there. You know, huge crowd that time. You know, back in November, and didn't expect anything too crazy. You know, we were walking back after everybody had gathered in front of the Supreme Court, you know, and there were a few threats from some, you know, Antifa BLM types against some friends of mine that were there wearing their MAGA hats, which I'll never wear. I'll wear a Pittsburgh hat till the day I die, because, you know, my dad beat that into me as a child.
Pirates?
Yeah. And so, you know, we're headed back, and Vladimir, he'd already gone to bed, and that was what it was. And Owen Schroyer and some of the rest of the InfoWars crew, they were hanging out in front of the JW Marriott. So I was just kind of kicking it there, hanging out with them and drinking their beer. At some point, they ran out of beer, and I told Owen Schroyer's security guard, I said, I got a bottle of tequila. I'll be right back. You know, so I run up the street, you know, as fast as I can, because I'm kind of fat, and I realized that the police have the street blocked off, and I can't get back to my hotel. And I'm like, well, this sucks. And I'm asking the police, I'm like, well, where do I go? How do I get back to my hotel? And they're like, you know, this is on 14th Street for anybody that knows DC. And they said, well, you need to go ahead and head west. And I was like, west? You mean you're corralling everyone over into BLM Plaza? Okay, this should go well.
Right.
So that's the way I went. And the next thing I knew, I was running a camera while Proud Boys and a bunch of other, I guess you could call them Patriot affiliates, were running roughshod in BLM Plaza and kicking ass and tearing banners down and the whole 9 yards. And so that was kind of where it all, started for me. I said, well, this is something's going on here.
It's good to know that about you, Shawn, that when the shit hits the fan, you're like, somebody give me a camera.
that's me, man.
Shawn walks into a gangbang. He's like, is anybody filming this?
Well, see, that goes back to my days in the thirst group that I was telling you about earlier.
Yeah. Everyone's like, grab your cocks. He's like, somebody hand me a camera.
Pretty much. If you don't give me a camera, I'm going to get involved.
Yeah, there you go.
So that's kind of how that started. And then after that, I went to Atlanta.
What's that moment like? You find yourself thrust into that situation. And was it clear cut to you kind of who was antagonizing and who was defending? I mean, what walk me through that moment of what it's like as you kind of find yourself in that situation.
I mean, in that moment, I'd seen all of the agitation prior. I mean, you had at least 1 million people there that particular rally.
And this is post-election, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Post-election, pre-January 6th.
Yes, sir. So that would have been November 14th.
Right.
And so you have 1 million people there. You have grandmothers and everybody else. And what really started it was that I had heard reports, and I had even seen Antifa, who attacked a guy who was selling Trump shirts, Biden shirts, and everything else. They attacked him and then took all his stuff out in the middle of Freedom Plaza and had set it on fire. And that was like right next to the JW Marriott Hotel as well. So it's kind of all in the same part. So you see these things going on. You know, people were starting to hear, from their Twitter feeds and everything else, that families were being attacked by Antifa and BLM while they were on their way back to their hotel. And so it's just kind of crazy. You're seeing them burn stuff right in Freedom Plaza that belonged to a guy who's screaming about fuck Antifa. And the cops are sitting there doing nothing besides protecting Antifa while they burn this guy's shit and making sure nobody goes and kicks their ass. So I can't get into the head of everybody who decided, that they'd had enough and that they were going to go to BLM Plaza and start a shit show. But it's like, it all seemed like, steady manipulation, whether you want to blame it on Mayor Bowser, which, on some level, I guess she was commanding DC Metro Police at that time, and even talking to the police, it was never this monolithic thing as far as what's going on, where they're following orders and doing what they do best. But it was just, there was a lot that happened in the lead up to even that violence that was then, I guess, exacted on them by, members of the Proud Boys and other groups, 3%ers, whoever else was involved. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess it's somewhat clear cut to a certain extent, but then you had kids, on that particular night, you had kids coming out on a bicycle. There was this guy and he started screaming, yeah, tear all that shit, burn that shit down. They don't represent us either. When people were trying to tear off the Black Lives Matter banner off of the church there, just north of the White House. And so it's just kind of like pandemonium, chaos. The police have zero control over the situation. And they were basically hunting these kids down. I met New Jersey. He's trying to run for District 9 in New Jersey, a guy named Billy Prempa, real good guy. And I met him on the streets because I saw a group that was actually chasing after this kid that they were claiming was Antifa or BLM. And like, they were going to kill him, man. I don't know. Like, he would have gotten the shit beat out of him to the point where he's not even breathing. I can just imagine. And I was like, no, just let him go, and I'm running the stream. And then Billy kind of saw me and he saw that. And there were lots of moments like that, that night. There were people tearing stuff out of the fencing that was put around the White House. And I was kind of standing there filming it. And I imagine I didn't have a particularly happy look on my face about it, because I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, okay, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And I'm watching all these Trump supporters just rip this fence, all these things people had put on it up, down. And actually, Gibson, the guy with Patriot Prayer, he walked up to me and he said, what's up, man? What's going on? Why you don't like this or whatever? I said, nah, man. I said, I don't really like this. I said, this isn't like positive speech. This is just tearing down other people's ideas. And he said, no, I get you. He says, let's get out here, walk with me. So I walked with him for a while, talked to him, real nice guy. So that was kind of the vibe there, and then after that, like I say, I went to Atlanta, Phoenix, back to DC on December 12th. I was there when the guy, stabbed a bunch of people.
The Antifa guy?
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and so you're kind of on the ground. You're seeing all this stuff progress. I mean, how are your views being shaped through all of this, of having like some firsthand exposure to it? I mean, did you feel yourself getting pulled in one direction versus the other? Did you feel like any of your, did you feel like some of your principles or things like that were being shaken or disturbed in any way by really sort of seeing this stuff in action on the ground level?
No, not really. Not on a principle level. I mean, to me, it was just, that first rally, I had no idea who the Proud Boys were beyond the jokes and the bad press. It meant nothing to me, but I see a bunch of guys running around wearing black and gold. Maybe that's, their subtle psychological manipulation of me where, I'm kind of fond of the black and gold. No, right. But you're a Philly guy, so we'll probably fight about that all day. Yeah. But
I grew up a Penguins fan, believe it or not.
Oh, okay. You're not totally retarded.
Not totally against when they drafted.
None of that creamsicle shit.
Yeah, when they drafted. No, I'm a Flyers fan now, but when they drafted Crosby was when I was like, I'm out.
That was your out point on that.
I hated Crosby, as a prospect, and I hated it, and I've continued to hate him now, and I kind of went back to being a Flyers fan in the early 2000s. So, and part of the reason why I was a Penguins fan growing up is because I hated Eric Lindros. As a kid,
he was a punk.
Up. Yeah, or just like just the whole.
He was like the original Crosby.
In a way, yeah. I got drafted here. I'm not going to play here, so you have to trade me. I mean, he pulled a John Elway early in his career, and or an Eli Manning, and there's a lot of guys who've done that throughout the career, and I've never really been a fan of any of them.
Yeah,
those guys who sort of like, this is the way it goes, and you make the best of a bad situation. You don't cry your way out of it. That's not America. So, I kind of grew up hating Lindros for that reason. Just like remember seeing that story, and I was just like, you don't just get the draft is the draft. You don't just get to decide you're not going to go where you're taken.
Especially if I'm going to compare him, to my idol as a kid, which was Lemieux, obviously.
Oh yes,
and you see a guy who saved a team,
greatest player of all time, by the way.
And then he saved a team. He saved that team. They wouldn't be in Pittsburgh anymore without him. So
no, not at all.
He might as well be, God on earth for a lot of Penguins fans.
And that's what I loved about Lemieux growing up was that he had all the imposing physicality of somebody like Lindros. But he had way more finesse and skill, and he just seemed to be a much classier player. You know what I mean? Like to go through non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and to like continue to play. I mean, what I think is hilarious to me is that people want to compare he and Gretzky as like 1A and B, and it's like, the fact that Lemieux came close to breaking any of Gretzky's records while battling cancer is unreal. And no player in the history of professional sports has had that level of dominance while going through cancer treatments. And, like, what did he miss? Like, not even half a season or 3/4 of a season? I mean,
he was playing sick. He played with a broken back.
Yeah.
You talk about lessons in perseverance. That shaped me a lot as a child.
Same. I saw that, was just like, what is anybody's excuse for anything? And I still beat myself up if I find myself sort of making those kinds of excuses to say like, Jesus Christ, go back and watch, a 30 for 30 or something about Mario Lemieux. And you're just like, I don't care who it is, Jordan, Gretzky, any of these other guys, nobody overcame what he had to overcome in the pursuit of greatness as a player.
Not at all.
And so, I'll always have a fondness, and I loved Jágr. I loved Jágr because everybody hated Jágr. That was probably like my first foray into contrarianism, was just like, oh, everybody hates this guy because he's good looking and he's so fucking talented. Well, good. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, good. I'm glad you hate him. He is good looking. He is talented. He's the best player in the league.
And then to see what he's done is pretty cool too.
Yeah, played so late in his career, and he's still playing. I think he's still playing over.
Oh yeah, I don't even pay attention to hockey anymore though. So there it is.
Well, we diverge there because it's still probably my favorite sport. That
the good old days.
I got back into baseball during the pandemic. I had watched since I was a kid, and I got really back into baseball, and so now I'd say that's probably my third sport, maybe even second. I almost feel like I'm enjoying baseball more than football now, but. Anyway, we're getting way off the subject. So,
well, and I'll get lost there because I haven't watched sports in like a long time.
Yeah, going back to your fondness of black and gold. So that might have been where the Proud Boys struck a chord with you.
Yeah.
And then as you're starting to meet some of these people and get involved in this world, I mean, did you have preconceived notions about them that started to change as you got to meet some of these guys?
I don't know. I don't think I had preconceived notions. I had what the media said about them. Right. But, I'd known that the media was full of shit for a long time. So, I just take it for what it's worth. I talk to guys on the street, get their opinions of things and their attitudes of things. And that was really it. So I don't know about preconceived notions. I just got to see a complete picture of, what they were on the streets of DC, streets of Atlanta at the time, Phoenix, and all these different places, different chapters, different characters.
And for people that are watching that really don't have any firsthand experience, I mean, what does the media get wrong about Proud Boys? I mean, what are they?
Yeah, they say they're racist. They say they're racist. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that they're not violent.
I don't think they would try to pretend that they aren't either.
Yeah, I've seen plenty of violence, but they're not racist. They're not white nationalists or anything like that. It's not about white power for the majority. I think that they've struggled even within their own organization to kind of deal with some of the more, racist elements. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of them even quietly would admit to that.
Yeah.
I think, obviously Enrique Tarrio, when he was named chairman, I think there were some grumblings about that. They didn't like that. They didn't like the idea of a, black Cuban guy being their chairman, or even the idea of a national, leader on some level. Mm-hmm. That was kind of the sentiment that I saw, but they really just seemed to me like kind of salt of the earth guys that wanted to do something positive or patriotic for their country in whatever capacity that they could. Mm-hmm. So I think at some point they've described themselves as a drinking club with a patriot problem. And I think that's pretty accurate. That's pretty accurate. But as far as them being, white nationalists or anything else, no, not at all.
Well, and they probably deal with some of that to the degree that any large organization falls into, where there's always going to be these sort of splintering of ideas. I mean, you don't have to look any further than the classic labor union disputes back during the Jimmy Hoffa years of, there were a lot of divergent opinions on how the unions were to best run and to best serve. And there were people who liked that the unions were sort of walking in tandem with organized crime and had those sort of protections. And then there were people who were vehemently against that and wanted to, split from organized crime as aggressively and as much as possible. So, and that split in ideology around how the unions run and who they were ingratiated to, ultimately is what led to Hoffa's assassination.
Yeah. I think that was a lot of it. That's a great way to describe it. I mean, you're never going to get this monolithic idea. It's like the same idea that says that everybody who was protesting Black Lives Matter, earlier in the summer was a Marxist. That's not true. That's a misrepresentation of what a lot of people were concerned about, whether you talk about police brutality, which I think they had some legitimate gripes.
Yeah.
And so it's like that. You can't just judge everybody based off of what you see on the news. That's not accurate. That's not fair. I mean, one of the most gracious people I met in my time out there was Joe Biggs. I met him on the street, didn't even understand who he was, didn't think anything about it, but we just had a conversation on the street, exchanged contact information because I thought he'd be a good guest on the show, which he did come on the show right before, January 6th and all that. And really one of the best guys I've ever met.
And so you're on the ground, you're traveling to all these places. I mean, how do things progress up to January 6th for you?
Well, I think what I saw, particularly in DC in the three different events, was that you had the 14th, which I kind of described how that kind of went haywire. On December 12th, going back, Proud Boys were in much greater numbers for that particular event. And the overall numbers for the rally were a lot less.
And to remind people, like, you know, in this time, this is post-election, there's a ton of dispute about the legitimacy of the election. And you know, I think for people on the conservative right, and I'll just say this from my perspective, you know, I was traveling the country, visiting family and doing stuff. And even going back to, like, I would say after 2016 when Trump won, we were filming my show for Food Network during that election, during the campaigning and going up to November of 2016. We were in production. And I remember kind of being, you know, we're in Tennessee, we're in Arizona, we're in Las Vegas, we're all over the country filming the show, Pennsylvania, New York. And around the world, or around the country, I'm seeing this real push behind Trumpism and this real push, almost like this sort of anti-leftist sentiment. And so in those 4 years between 16 and 20, that just continued to ramp up. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, there's no way that this election, with an even less popular candidate, because indisputably Joe Biden was less popular than Hillary Clinton, which, you know, is a huge statement, but I think a true one. I'm thinking there's absolutely no way this isn't going to be a landslide in Trump's favor for re-election. And not to mention, historically, incumbents have gotten re-elected in almost every election in my lifetime. So we haven't had a one-term president since Bush won. I was very young when that happened. But, you know, when you look at those types of things, and then what I felt like was the groundswell of support for Trump, I was like, there's absolutely no way this is going to go the other way. So I think even if you're somebody who kind of had their finger on the pulse and wasn't living in the TDS world of people who were just so deranged by Trump and thought he was the death of democracy, that you're thinking this is obviously going to go in favor of a Trump reelection. And then when you started to see it swing so dramatically the other direction, you start to go, this doesn't feel right. Like, this just doesn't pass the smell check. And you know, I think it started from there and bubbled all the way up to January 6th.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a lot of it. I think another thing that people don't realize is that a lot of people that were at these different events were not what I would call Trump supporters. They were not your hardcore MAGA types. You know, so that was interesting, especially amongst the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys, a lot of them I talked to were not what I would call MAGA types. But they were willing to say that there's a problem, that we don't like this creep of fascism under the guise of communism, which is really what it is, and all these other things, and that it really wasn't about Trump. It was about election integrity as a whole, and taking a stand for that. So I think that that's something that got misconstrued. You know, there was a large majority of people that were what I would call MAGA types, but that was not, you know, representative of the whole. Not the
entire thing.
No, which goes back to everything else that we've talked about, whether we're talking about Proud Boys. You know, people want these monolithic ideas so that they can label people and categorize them and, you know, subjugate them usually.
Well, and I think we live in a time now where it's easier for the everyday person to kind of get swept up on these sides, because and I've said this many times, I think the biggest pandemic we're facing in this country right now and as a culture is a crisis of purpose. And when you look at the advent of atheism and you look at the fact that we really we don't have anything that kind of culturally gives people purpose, I think a lot of lost individuals are searching for it. And I think that's how they find themselves, either being on the Proud Boy MAGA supporting side or the BLM sort of Antifa side. And I think, I think there are a lot of people who just intend to do well, who kind of end up falling onto one of those two sides of the aisle, and might even get swept up in sort of marching for things they don't even necessarily agree with, because it is very black and white. It is like, well, you can't kind of be in support of BLM, you got to be all the way. Or you can't kind of be a MAGA guy or a Proud Boy, you got to be all the way. And so I do think that unfortunately, I think a lot of people in our society today are ill-equipped to participate in those groups because they've sort of lost the ability to push back. And, by nature of how they sort of end up there in the first place, it doesn't surprise me that people are likely to kind of fall in line with maybe ideologies they don't entirely, ascribe to. But now you're part of the group, and it's better to feel like you have a purpose and that you're putting that purpose into action than to feel fully aligned with that purpose. Does that make sense? Absolutely. No, I think that's a pretty accurate assessment of how these things happen, how these groups are able to recruit. And you're seeing it happen, and I think it's happening simultaneously on both sides of the extremes. Oh, yeah. Where they're basically taking people that sort of lean that way or sort of lean the other way, and they're just getting their arms around them entirely. And then, as you see, you've got people at the tops of these organizations or different groups or whatever, like that obviously, are ultimately looking out for their own self-interest. Like you see the BLM woman has got like now 10 properties or something, around the country, and is obviously she's a tycoon now. Yeah, and like enriched herself beyond her wildest dreams, heading up this organization that's supposed to be about reform and inequality. And nothing says equality like hoisting yourself up upon a golden throne. The hypocrisy there it's beyond the pale. And the only counter argument I would have as to like which side is right is like, show me the equivalent of that on the conservative side. Like who is buying multi-million-dollar properties all over the country on the right? I mean, it doesn't. Some people might say, well, I have an answer there, and it'll probably piss everybody off. Yeah, who is that? Oh, Donald Trump. Yeah, well, there you go. That might be. That's probably very, very true, right? It's hard for me to walk away from that, and it gets me a lot of flack. That's where I talk about is when you try to run this kind of down the middle assessment of the world around you, usually what happens is you just piss everybody off. Yeah, there's no room for objectivity anymore, is there? No. Because people say like, well, even if you're being it's almost like being a heretic in the church days of like, you can't even criticize the church without being ostracized from it. And, it's amazing that we see this kind of behavior in a lot of these other cultist organizations. Like when you watch the documentaries about the Nexium cult and you see that the first people to sort of question things or challenge things were immediately ostracized. You see it in Scientology. You see it even going all the way back to, who was the guy in Texas, Waco, Texas? Koresh. Koresh. You see it when you go back and you read the books about that organization. And so, I think the minute that you find yourself in any group that forbids questioning the motives of the group, that's when you need to get the fuck out of there. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I've never been a group guy, because like my nature is to question first and go, wait, what the fuck is everybody doing about this? And that doesn't make me a good conformist. Well, it's interesting that I've done a lot of work with Stu Peters. Some people may know who he is. Apparently he's pretty popular these days. I've watched him blow up to where I think he's like either the number 1 or number 2 podcast on Apple. But I've known him for a long time. And so I've worked with him on different things. I would give him reports, when I was on the ground here and everything else. But, recently he's been sharing some of my stuff. And so, I would get a bump in following from that, but then it turns into this thing where I just end up having to weed through all these people, and I watch the numbers drop because once they realize that I'm not, running around with, my tongue up Trump's ass, they get upset with me, but whatever, that's what it is. Yeah, certainly. So now we find ourselves, in this sort of timeline of your story. We find ourselves arriving at January 6th, and kind of walk me through that day for you. Oh, January 6th. What a hell of a day. So, I mean, I had gotten there early, and I guess we should talk a little bit about this. Was on January 5th, there were a lot of speeches in Freedom Plaza. Now, at the time, I had already been banned from Facebook from streaming there, which was kind of how I would connect with my audience. And the reason why was because I had posted Proud Boys tenets as they sit, no commentary. Just said, these are their tenets. Take it for what it's worth. Well, Facebook is considered that hate speech. And so I caught a ban for that. So I wasn't able to ban there. So I said, fine, I'll get on TikTok. So hop on TikTok. And in about 4 or 5 days, I was able to get a little over 20,000 followers there.
I said, oh, this is pretty sweet. Get a little monetization, not going to get rich off of it, but it's nice. I can live stream and do this. Well, I was sitting there streaming live there, and they cut it off. They banned my account. They said that I was promoting hate speech there as well. And I said, this is getting weird. I said, they're just really trying to cut off any sort of independent voice from anything to do with this event. So, that was that on that night. Went over to BLM Plaza. There were some people there that evening. One of them was Bobby Pickles. He was selling shirts. Enrique Tarrio did nothing wrong. So I bought one of those up, and Brennan Gutenschwager of, what do they call it? BGO on the scene or something like that.
Okay.
He's real popular on Twitter. You'll see his videos everywhere. He's in DC today, independent journalist. And he had said, well, can I take your picture? And I said, sure. This is a freedom of speech thing. Sure. I'll hold up this shirt saying Enrique Tarrio did nothing wrong. I was there. Mm-hmm. So, so he takes that picture, and I figure I'm going to get flamed by Antifa for that. And that's fine. Go back to the hotel. Everything's fine. Get up the next morning, go down to the rally. Everything seemed okay. Nothing really bizarre. Trump was speaking. You couldn't even get anywhere near him. The person that was supposed to get me better access had drank too much the night before and didn't even make it. So I was, way back in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, that's the side of J6 that doesn't really get a lot of coverage. Is how there was this almost like this fucking Mardi Gras vibe for some.
No, it was out. Yeah,
there were a lot of people who partied too hard on the 5th and didn't even make the January 6th shenanigans.
And it was like that at every rally. I mean, I've got to say that. I mean, most of the restaurants were doing things. That's another thing about J6 that doesn't get publicized enough, was that the mayor had shut down all the restaurants, really, and she had shut down all the food carts. So, I've made the joke a lot since then. I've said, well, the reason why J6 happened was because all the boomers, they got cranky because there was nothing to eat.
Yeah, they were hungry. Yeah, let me tell you something. I get radicalized real fucking quick without something in my belly, man.
There may be something more to that, but that is the joke I've made, because there was nowhere to eat. There were no bathrooms. The bathrooms were overflowing with piss and shit.
Yeah.
That were available around Washington Monument. So it was kind of disgusting. And so, at some point Trump speak, and I can hear only so much of it. I'm getting B-roll of the crowd. That's about as good as I can do at that point, but it's nothing particularly interesting. And so I've got to use the bathroom. So I go down there, and that's when I witnessed that atrocity. And I remember this guy coming up to me, and he starts talking this Q shit. And he's like, oh yeah, JFK Jr. is going to show up today. And I'm like, man, what the fuck is going on here? Mm-hmm. This is just weird. This is really weird. And at some point I decided I'm just going to go to the Capitol, because I knew that there was going to be some sort of a protest there. Yeah. There had been
speaking. There was some scheduled speakers there, right?
Yeah. There were scheduled speakers. Things were supposed to be happening. Even, Ollie Alexander, was Stop the Steal at the time. He had talked about how there was going to be like a peaceful occupation of the grounds, to the point where for me, knowing that I might be there for a long time if that happened, like I had taken a tent, to just get ready for that possibility. So I start walking to the Capitol down the mall, and I'm not thinking much of it. I get a message from one of my sources that I've spoken to a lot within one of the agencies, and said that there had been bombs planted. Watch your ass. Okay, I'll watch my ass. This was kind of what I was getting to that evening of the 5th, was I just had a feeling that night that there was going to be something weird. Mm-hmm. And going back, and I hate to do this, but even telling my family before I left, I just said, I don't know, I got a bad feeling about this. But, I've been covering this thing the whole time. I can't not go. Mm-hmm. This is like, this is the end of it. Whatever it is, it's the end of the story.
The culmination of the story.
Sure. Right? And so, I'm walking to the Capitol. That was about the halfway point. By the time I got to the Capitol, the crowd had already pushed all the way up to the inauguration stage. So there was nothing to even say that there was anything weird, except you could hear tear gas being fired off. So again, me being the idiot I am, what do? Get up to the front of it. Get right up to the front of it. Get in the action. So I was on the west side of the Capitol building there, and that's where I was. There was a group that was pushing up the stairway there, and tear gas going off all over the place. I didn't see it with my own eyes. Apparently, I recorded it with my stream at the time. But there was a guy that the cops shoved off the stairs up at the top. I don't even know which person he was, and there seems to be a lot of debate. But it's my understanding that he died. He looked pretty dead when he fell. He didn't fall right. It wasn't, a nice, pretty thing. So, I'm just looking at all this, and it's just an absolute shit show going on in front of me. And then at some point, it's like the police got overwhelmed. There were people flanking from behind their line, and I'm right up on the police line necessarily. That's where I'm at. And then they kind of stood down and everybody moved up those stairs. And so, I said at the time, I said, well, here I am. This is what we're doing. And I went up those stairs. And then I went up to the top of the inauguration stage trying to get like an overview of the crowd looking out. There was a cop up there and she screamed at me. She said, "You get down off here." Yes, ma'am. Because that's what you learn when you're dealing with these situations. When the cops tell you to do something, just do it.
Yeah.
Just
do it. You don't want to be the next guy thrown over the stairs,
I'm not.
right?
I'm not there to fight with cops. I'm not there to do all this other shit. Like, fine, okay, I'll get down. So I get down, and then I kind of walked over towards it's like the northwest entrance into the building and everything, and there was a lot of people kind of gathered over there and everything else, and eventually things were breached. People started opening doors, and so I went in.
So this is a great spot for us to kind of pause and get into the bonus show. So before we do that though, obviously, and I want people to stay tuned. If you're watching along with this live on YouTube or you're listening on any podcast platforms, the best way to get the remainder of the show is to go to my locals page. Go to joshdenny.locals.com. All the full show there is there ad-free, as well as the bonus portion, which we're about to get into, where we'll talk with Shawn about kind of the events of that day and then what has happened since then. And obviously this has created some legal troubles for you. If people want to participate and they want to, find out more about that, they can go to givesandgo.com/Witzemann Family Fun. They can kind of see, your story and kind of what you're going through now and since then, which we'll talk about here going into the after show. But, right off the bat, Shawn, I want to say thank you for coming on board and telling your story. And we're not done, obviously. But, for people that are listening along and you want to hear the rest, like I said, go to joshdenny.locals.com. You can get the full ad-free episodes there, as well as the bonus show once we get past the hour mark. So, I
appreciate you having me. I will say that this has been good.